Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the July 20th of July meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee at North Norfolk District Council. So our first item on the agenda is to receive apologies for absence.
Yes, we have apologies from Councillors Nhs Pathways, Councillor Liz Withington, Councillor Saul Penfold, Councillor Peter Fisher. I note that we also have apologies from officers Steve Hems and Steve Blatch.
Thank you. And any substitutes this morning?
Unfortunately, none that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. Item 3 is public statements, public questions and statements. I'm not aware of any.
We haven't received any direct to the committee. I will note that Linda McGilligan shared a email with me that went to the leader in regards to the second homes report, and as it wasn't shared with the committee directly, I won't be sharing that today. But if anyone wants to see that in due course, we can.
Okay, is that something that we will consider when we get to that item on the agenda?
Yes, absolutely, we can do. Yep.
Thank you. Turning to the minutes of our last meeting, that was the meeting held on the 15th of June. If we can go through them for accuracy first, please. Page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. I saw no hands raised at any stage, so could I have a proposer and a seconder, please, to accept those minutes? Councillor Cushing and Councillor Husden. And could I have a show of hands, please? That looks like unanimous amongst those of us who are here. Items of urgent business, I'm not aware of any.
None received.
Thank you. Declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest in respect of the business on our agenda today? Councillor Holliday.
I'd like to disclose a pecuniary conflict of interest in item 11 in that I own a holiday let in the district, and I haven't got a dispensation from the Standards Committee, so I'll need to leave the room during the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, yes. Perhaps we'll consider the issues when we get to that topic. Is that right?
We can do, although Councillor Holliday has received some previous advice on regard to that.
Okay, thank you. Item 7, petitions from members of the public.
None received.
Item 8, consideration of any matter referred to the committee by a committee. Again, I'm not aware of any.
None received.
Thank you. And item 9, responses of the council or the cabinet to the committee's reports or recommendations.
There's none on this occasion.
Thank you. So turning to item 10, that's our first substantive item of business on our agenda today. This is to consider the ambulance response times monitoring, and I believe we have two representatives joining us remotely today from the Integrated Commissioning Board. We have Ross Collett. Good morning to you, Mr. Collett.
Good morning.
And we have Marcus Bailey from the East of England Ambulance Trust. Good morning to you, Marcus.
Good morning.
Right, so just to before we kick off, my understanding is that you've both seen, I think, a number of questions that were raised prior to us agreeing the meeting today, and I believe we've had some replies to those, and I believe we've had some response in regard to data that was requested, but not, I believe, a full set of data, or if there has been, I'm not seeing them. So I wonder if who would like to lead off in terms of sort of starting with those questions, and I think it would be very helpful if we based our discussions around those questions rather than go into a whole range of other matters which may not be quite as germane to our concerns as they might be. Would you be willing to go along with that approach?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Right. Well, who would like to lead off then?
Shall I just?
You're okay with the date of it?
And Chair, thank you very much. And just so I can support and assist the committee, I think we're looking at some of the advanced questions, particularly related from the move. Starts with one of the questions related to the move from CCG to ISCB. Is that the questions that you're referring to? Just so I can assist the committee. I believe they were the ones we were looking at.
Sorry, Marcus, but so was that in relation to that first question there on the ICB? And
are they the ones? Yeah, just for us is just they're the ones that we would be looking to progress through to try and assist with answering. Is just so we can meet the expectations of the meeting.
okay, yep.
Is that okay? We'll start that discussion that way. So I'm going to hand over, and Chair, thank you for the opportunity to attend. I'm Marcus Bailey. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Ambulance Trust. And I was going to look at answering some of the ambulance specific elements within the additional questions, and then look to bring in Ross to talk about the wider system and also the move from CCG to ICB, if that is suitable for the committee to then open up the discussion. So we know that from a responsiveness that it is a challenge in a number of areas, and Norfolk and North Norfolk is no different, and obviously particular focus of the committee today. I think in specific response to the question, we are going to be leaving the rapid response vehicles beyond September, so we've got no plans to remove them for the rest of the financial year, as we believe that with winter and also the impact as we emerge from.
Hold you there, Marcus, please. Just a moment.
I'll see what I can do. Marcus and Ross, do you have headsets at all that you could use?
Are we a bit faint?
It's just a bit muffled, is all. Yeah.
Right, hang on one.
I don't, I'm afraid.
Just bear with me. I'm just going to try and turn the volume at our end.
Home PC, but I'll try and turn the volume
No,
up.
that's all right. I too was struggling. So
Bear with me.
Is that better? Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Does that help? Can you hear me any better now?
you're not coming through any louder to me at this point. It's the volume, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, volume and clarity, I think.
Is that any better now? Anything at all? How's that?
Can you give us a sound check, Marcus, please?
Yeah. Hello, any better now? Does that assist?
Louder, yes. Clarity, we'll wait and see.
Okay, no problem. Let me try that one again. So I've just moved some of the equipment to see if that makes a difference. Thank you. If I just start right here. So we'd obviously acknowledged some of the responsive challenges, particularly into Norfolk. And I know one of the questions from the committee, which we've been to before, was around the response cars. So we are planning to leave the response cars in place for the rest of this financial year. That's driven by a couple of things that we'll touch upon when Ross and us talk about the system and future commissioning arrangements. But actually, we're going to be leaving that through to allow that time for that review to happen and those discussions to occur. And I think are sensible as we go into winter, the summer, and also from COVID as well. The other bit to support, because that's obviously the framework of how we respond with using cars. The other thing that we're also doing specifically within Norfolk to assist within the Norwich control room. So we'll be training over additional 100 call handlers to pick up and answer 909 calls. So that's really important as part of that timely response. The reason it's really...
Marcus, can I just stop you there? Unfortunately, I think we are struggling here at this end to make complete sense because of clarity. We've got the volume, but it's just...
Okay.
There is some distortion in your speech that makes it very difficult. It's almost as though there's like another mic open somewhere, but I don't think I can see one. But the only way that I can see that perhaps clarity might be better if you had a headset with a mic, and that would be the only. Is there any chance that you might lay your hands on one while perhaps we continue with Ross?
Give me a few minutes and I'll see what I can do.
Okay. Right. Well, in the absence of that, Ross, are you able to pick up?
Yes, of course. Can I just check you can all hear me okay? Because unfortunately,
Indeed, you are significantly clearer and of sufficient loudness. Thank you.
Good, lovely. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone, and good morning, Chair. Just to introduce myself, so I'm Ross Collett. I'm Associate Director of Urgent and Emergency Care for now the Integrated Care Board. So just coming to the questions that you'd outlined, as I think as Marcus was beginning to say, so in the current round, we've rolled over contracts as we were doing through the pandemic. So we're in a sort of a rollover situation in terms of the contract this year. And those contract negotiations will start again in sort of Q3 for the following year. So there's no proposed changes to the current commissioning arrangements with the ambulance service as it stands at the moment. I think, as Marcus says, that rollover for us means that Marcus is able to keep some of those additional RRVs in place. So he's got, as I understand it, no plans to remove those. And I think in terms of getting into some of the things, which I'm sure we'll go into a bit more detail, but that has also allowed us with that rollover arrangement to also invest some more into the ambulance service contract this year around some of the support for ambulance delays, which again we can come on to in a later session. But yeah, just to confirm, there are no planned changes to the current regional commissioning arrangements in this year, and those contract negotiations will start again from about Q3.
So would you like to lead us, take us through those questions?
Happy to. Yeah, so if I get into some of the things that the ICB and at system level that we're doing to support handover delays, particularly the North Norfolk patch, but I guess as you'd appreciate, this will be in general across both QE at Kings Lynn and also the Norfolk and Norwich hospital as well. So in terms of the RCB plans, that there are the plans are, as you'd expect, cover a number of areas. We tend to break down our plans to support the system into four, I guess, quadrants is the easiest way to describe it. So it's the things that we're doing as a system across all providers in that sort of pre-hospital arena. So working on how do we, it's not, people often talk about reducing demand. I think that the terminology, I don't like that terminology particularly, because actually when a patient's need arises, I think we should be in a position to respond. So it's more about how we're getting patients the right response. So regardless of whether they were to contact 999 or 111 or their GP, if they have an urgent care need, whatever that is, the system needs to be able to respond. One of the key things we're doing, which will, again, in order to support Marcus and his team to have the capacity to respond faster around those C1 and C2 response times, is those things in that pre-hospital end that will, in theory, help to give back some capacity. So one of the pieces of work Marcus's team and other providers with the ICP support have been doing is around coming together in an MDT, sort of multidisciplinary team type approach, to look at the 999 stack, particularly the urgent care stack, to see what more the community can do to essentially pull patients from that stack. So these will be people that will have rung 999, but actually we may be able to respond in a different way. It won't necessarily always require an ambulance. That MDT approach we've been piloting for the last couple of months, and that brings together both teams from the ambulance service, it brings together community, it brings together social care, but also 111. They review that stack and they look at those patients that they can respond to in a different way rather than dispatch an ambulance. The intention obviously is twofold. One, we get to patients faster, but with the right response. But obviously, if we're not then having to use ambulance service resource, that gives back more capacity to Marcus and the team to then be able to respond to those genuine emergencies. So the C1 life-threatening, but also then the C2 life-threatening, life-changing. So that's a key piece of work. I'm happy to pause there before I go on, if that's helpful.
Yes, thank you. Would you like to continue at that point, or do you want to revert back to Marcus?
No, I'm happy to carry on if that's helpful. I just didn't know whether there were any questions. Obviously, I'm struggling to see you all. So, but
I see no hands raised at the moment, but I think we're in. Sorry, it's just done by one.
Yeah, yes, I have got a question, if that's all right. Yeah.
Yes, Councillor Housden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was a report, you've talked about the community approach. There was a report in the newspapers at the weekend that the ambulance trust or the services do not have a comprehensive record of the distribution of defibrillators. Now, that's a particularly worrying concept in North Norfolk because of the distribution of villages, but equally because under our sustainable fund, we provide finance for defibrillators in some of the smaller communities. But I would have thought, given you're looking at a sort of 1 or 2 or 3 stage approach, that the registration of defibrillators in any one locality would be a very key point to start from, at least to the local community in an interim situation for ambulance response time. So my question really is, what's the timescale to get a complete comprehensive registration of defibrillators?
Sounds like one for you, Marcus.
Yes, I think that is something that the ambulance service manages. So, Marcus, is that something you're able to comment on?
Yeah, hopefully, can you hear me any better now?
Indeed.
Perfect. Okay, I managed to find a headset there, and apologies for that earlier.
Well done.
So then part of the National Defibrillator Network project is ongoing at the moment. We've done a first wave of all the records that we hold and have gone out to the guardians of the defibrillators, and it then becomes about uploading those records and data validation. So in terms of timescales, we're looking to try and get that picture completed by the end of October as we run into winter. And we know that every day that goes past, more and more defibrillators are becoming registered on that national network. But it is by the end of October, we're looking to have that position as well. I think also from a point of view of consolidation, one of the things that probably really helpful for from the committee and for us is that where you have a consolidated list of defibrillators that you have very kindly and generously supporting the community, that actually if we were to be able to pass that, we could also do a double check and confirm that as well, because there's nothing like a level of assurance that assists us with tracking those that we know down as well.
Okay, thank you. There was a second part of that question, because also there's now, as I understand it, once a defibrillator has been used, the batteries have to be replaced, and I understand there's a shortage of batteries. Is that something that you're currently on top of?
Yeah, so we have had the batteries on order. We've now started to receive those additional supplies of batteries. So they had been outstanding since the end of last year, but they have now started to come back into stock, and we have distributed over 100 batteries already. So yes, we are building the stocks and we are distributing those out.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I've got one more question for you, Councillor Holliday.
Ross, can you quantify the decrease in ambulance dispatch from the MDT team approach, please? Thank you.
Yes, we can. So we've had a relatively small number in that pilot, but actually in terms of percentage drop, so we've been able to pull 48% of those calls away from the ambulance service. But what I can share, Victoria, because we're only now just validating that information, I'm happy to share that with the group afterwards in terms of the actual numbers, because we're literally preparing the evaluation as we speak. But early numbers suggest of all the calls that we've reviewed, or all of the stack that we've reviewed, about 48% we're able to pull away and respond to patients in a different way that doesn't then require an ambulance.
Okay, you content with that? Thank you very much. No further questions at this point. So if you'd like to continue on, over to you, Ross.
Thank you. So I think that's pre-hospital. Again, there's some other things that we can talk about in terms of how do we support operationally. So again, I think, I'm sure as the committee will know, that the system is under significant pressure. And one of the things that we're obviously all concerned about, particularly, is the risk we carry in the community when we can't get ambulances to patients. One of the contributory factors to that, in fact, there is a direct correlation, I know Marcus can share a bit more, is around the ambulance delays that we have at hospitals. So there is some very specific things that the system has worked together on to try and reduce those delays at hospitals. So there are some very specific things around having now invested in hospital acute liaison officers across all three. We previously only had those at the Norfolk and Norwich. We now have them at the Queen Elizabeth as well, and actually the James Paget. So we've done that across the whole system. So that gives some management support and support to crews on site. In addition to that, as a Norfolk and Waveney system, we are trialling what they're calling a C2 rapid release. So when we have a clinical concern from the ambulance service ops centre that they cannot get to a C2 patient, they will contact the hospital, and that then they agree with the site team in the emergency department a crew to be released to ensure that we can then respond to those C2. So that's something we've been trialling in Norfolk and Waveney. I think there's only one other trust in the region currently that operates that system. I know that's been used, and again, we're actively evaluating that. That has been used quite a lot recently, particularly at the NNN, to again release crews to be able to respond. And it builds on something that's been in place for quite some time, which is around the C1 similar approach around a drop and go. So all of our hospitals now keep cubicles free so that they can respond to that clinically driven response from the ambulance service if they need to release a crew very quickly. So we've got that in place. We've also worked with the Ambulance Trust and with our hospitals to ensure that we can create flexible capacity when we know our emergency departments are full and struggling, and that obviously contributes then to ambulance offload delays. How do we increase support for the emergency departments, both with Marcus's teams and with the hospital teams, to manage patients, to release crews? So we're creating cohorting areas, if you like, that enables us to manage and look after patients safely within the hospital, that also then helps to release crews. So there's a number of measures that we've worked on together to again try and improve those response times given the pressures the system is under currently, and to also reduce those hospital delays. So again, happy to pause there before I sort of carry on in terms of other work that we're doing.
Okay, thank you. I've got one question from Councillor Holliday.
Thank you. I understand that the NNUH has got the longest ambulance waiting times in the region by far, and the QH is the 4th. And obviously this impacts a lot on our response times from what you're saying. I'd just like to point out some data. I know that you didn't have time to get the postcode data in for this meeting. I have some from earlier in the year for our coastal areas. And I've got some C1 mean times for NR23 of up to 35 minutes, and for NR24 of up to 23. NR25 is the next worst area But it really, that gives one to believe that these very long ambulance handover delays, particularly at our local acutes, are really making life much more difficult for us as a micro environment. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
I'm happy to comment, and then I'm sure Marcus, if you want to come in behind me. But I mean, first thing to acknowledge, I think, is that none of these delays are acceptable. I think none of the system would argue around delays, and concerns around patient safety is obviously our biggest concern. So I think you're absolutely right; those delays are unacceptable, and we recognise there are things and are doing in order to give back capacity to the ambulance service to be able to respond faster. I know, again, you're not wanting to get into huge levels of detail as to the reasons why, but I guess it is contextual to say that one of the things that is contributing to the problems is the staffing issue that we have. So as our numbers in Norfolk and Waveney of COVID infections rise, so we've peaked in the last week or so, and those COVID numbers have been rising quite rapidly over the last few weeks. We have obviously seen a rise in staff sickness, which doesn't help, and that's right across the board. And I think we are still, in a sense, coming out of the pandemic with quite a challenged workforce position across the whole of our provider system, with still relatively high numbers of sickness and relatively long-term issues around staff burnout. So that obviously contributes to some of those issues. Hence, all of those measures we're putting in place in order to try and reduce those delays. But absolutely, I would acknowledge those delays are unacceptable. But Marcus, I don't know whether there's anything you'd want to add.
Thanks, Ross. Look, I think it is always a really fine balance, and we know that from the harm analysis that we've undertaken, Ross is absolutely right. So incrementally, a number of the actions are, I guess we have to try and tackle it from both sides, because it's a combination of solutions on this one. So again, I'm not going to kind of dive into the discharge or flow from the hospital, because there has to be a bit around what we can try to do in the pre-hospital environment. So if I look at category 1 response, and it's always very difficult because the numbers are very low and the margins are very fine when it comes to, I guess, the risk and the outcome. We know that from most of our patient safety data that it's our category 2 patients where the greatest risk, and in part that's the volume of the category 2 is significant compared to category 1. Category 1 and category 2 combined is about 70-75% of the activity that we would see, but it's a C1 is a smaller proportion. So there's one thing about increasing and bolstering our responders who can respond to a C1. So public access defibrillation is one that a colleague spoke about, increasing our work with the fire and rescue service, and we have now got a memorandum of understanding available for every fire and rescue service. It's a template, and it's about that category 1 C1 responding, and we know that Norfolk Fire and Rescue are working with us on doing that. It's about CFRs, and I know there's a comment in a question, but to be really clear and reiterate, the support from our volunteers, particularly in rural communities, is essential and vital. And we have drafted a paper to support the practicalities of being able to pay for their mileage to assist them in terms of that continued work that they undertake in a voluntary capacity, but recognise those out-of-pocket expenses, particularly in the cost of living era that we're in at the moment. And the other bit that we've just launched, and it is a small scale pilot, but Norfolk is one of those areas, is the introduction of a volunteer staff responder scheme. So need to be very clear, this is not about forcing people, but this is about, we've had requests from staff who said, look, I'd like to be able to support and respond in the community. So incrementally, all of those really look to support our ability to respond. I think the other bit that Ross was saying, and so the rationale of why would we look at some of our lower acuity patients. So there's a couple of big things for us, which is we know that we manage resourcing and we manage the flow through our job cycle time, it's called. So from the start of a call to the finish of a call. And we know that if you can reduce or eliminate the need to transport a patient to the emergency department where there may be delays, it actually therefore reduces your job cycle time and therefore makes your resources, your ambulances, your cars more available, and therefore they're able to respond in that manner. So if we're able to mitigate the risk through some of our system work, particularly for patients who are laying on the floor for long periods, and we'll see the data that Ross spoke about with regards to the access to patients waiting and that multidisciplinary team, we know there was a number of those patients who had fallen who were moved into Swift services. So again, really important to reduce the effect of long lies. The other bit is then around what other options and avenues we have that we're able to focus on category 2. So incrementally, all of these are designed to look to reduce the response time, but also improve the response to patients within each of those categories as well. And for us, it's always about the ways that we can look to try and undertake different ways, which is why we call them test of change pilots, whichever way you view it, but there's always bits to say, look, it's never about standing still and it's never about accepting, because there is always a risk that we become paralyzed in thought, because the challenge to manage hospital handover delays can be so big. So therefore, we have to think of other alternatives and other ways we do that. And it also factors into some of the work that we're looking with the North Norfolk GP Federation as well, particularly on advanced paramedics and working closer in the community, because each one of these is about, can we move signpost and flow patients in a slightly different way, with the aim of protecting our response to category 1 and reducing the time for category 2. So all of them coming together.
Okay, pause for questions on that so far. No. Oh, Councillor Housden.
Thank you very much to both of you, actually. This might sound slightly disingenuous, but surely we've had COVID for well over the effects of COVID within the system for over 2 years, and without a shadow of a doubt, it's going to remain with us for a long time. And I think we could easily consider 5 years. And I accept sort of what you're doing what I would see around the edges, but surely strategic long-term planning and strategic recruitment to greater numbers, which I know is a central government issue and requires finance, but surely that has to be your key strategy, because with more people, then the issue about response times improves dramatically. And, you know, we call on volunteers a lot in this country, in my opinion, far too much. And I think, you know, we've only got to look at the fire service over the last 48 hours, and they've been stretched in every which direction. And so I think I would like to hear sort of more about longer term strategic planning. And I know this feeds back into central government. I do fully understand that, but I think that's something that would give a lot of comfort to people looking not in the next quarter or the next year even, but looking sort of 4 or 5 years on.
If I come at it from an ambulance perspective and then pass it, so look, you're absolutely right as well. And I think so all of the stuff we're doing as test of change actually is really exciting, because it's about the how do we evolve and how do we move forward. But the strategic element to that is around the urgent and emergency care from the ambulance service and the models of care that we then provide from that. And that looks at the way that we deliver the service from a control room, a technology, digitalization, around workforce, around integration. So you are absolutely right. You're probably not going to hear any director of operations come on to a call and talk to you to say they wouldn't like more staff. So the answer is, of course, we would like more staff, and there is a discussion to be had. I think there is a reality, though, of workforce will become challenged based around recruitment. We know that for instance, our Band 3 recruitment is particularly challenged, and therefore some of the national strategies around recruitment retention and particularly around workforce pay do impact and affect, and we notice that across health and social care. But absolutely, workforce and recruitment is key. Skill set and diversification of workforce is also part of that, and that's making sure that we look at enhancing career pathways for our registered healthcare professionals and non-registered teams, because actually it's about that attraction and retention, but also thinking differently, coming back to the strategic models of care. There's also another key bit for the ambulance service that we're looking at. So if I look at digitalisation wider than technology to support, so such as we're doing today, and I appreciate the slight bumpy start with the headset, but if you look at remote technology to be able to triage, and some of the work that we're able to mainstream from an ambulance service perspective, there is one key strategic decision that we're looking to put in front of our trust board during this financial year, which relates to the triage software that we use and utilise as an ambulance service. Now, I won't bore you with some of the details, but in essence, we have two choices: stick with what we've got, or consider and look at moving over to Nhs Pathways, where you gain kind of, I guess, a different lens of assessment. So we use a triage software. Pathways, Nhs Pathways is an assessment software, and therefore it gives you a greater range of being able to focus staffing and your skill sets within there as well. And that innovation, or that digitalization, we have to do almost everything we've spoken about. We have to be able to test and challenge, because I think that in summary, coming back to the very kind of the practical but strategic side, is we can't keep doing what we're doing. We have to do something different. That will require digitalization. It will require workforce growth to a point, but also, I guess, some change around how we look at skill set and supervision. It will also look at how technology supports us to I say beat geography, but actually it's how do you look at technology in the right place to assist. So even in the next 2 months, we're really exciting. We talk about virtual wards. We're looking at piloting the use of the virtual ward for ambulance services. Now, it's never been done in the east of England, but all of those are, can we keep people well at home? There's another dimension to the strategy when we look at health inequality for the ambulance services. What is our part to play in public health? So what is it about education? What is it about keeping people in a more well position than an unwell position? And some of the basics when we look at health, that health inequalities of respiratory, blood pressure, cardiac disease, and the role that the ambulance service can play in prevention as well. So that I think from a strategic point, absolutely right. But all of these practical schemes really does help us to test some of that in a very practical sense, and I'm happy to kind of talk a bit more about some of those that we're piloting, because we have piloted some of those up in Cromer as a test of change. But our plan for this year, if you said how do we lead into that, recruitment of more staff, increased use of private ambulance service in Norfolk, increasing call handlers in our control rooms, particularly in Norwich, as well, increased use, tailored but increased use of agency staffing that we're able to bring on board as well, and they're kind of our top 4 internal actions, while we then look at a big range of what we would class as system. And I know we can sometimes overuse those words, but the examples that Ross gave of the multidisciplinary team meetings, that's a system in kind of everybody buying into. We're managing patient flow, we're supporting patient and trying to get the right patient to the right place at the right time. We've also done a pilot in Cromer where we've given our teams access digitally, so electronically, to patient records for the area, and to trial it. And it is a limited pilot, but actually it's these things that make a difference. And we know that we've seen in that group though a scalable, we believe, and it's actually being discussed at the next meeting I'm going to, about do we look to scale that further in Norfolk as a greater pilot and then across the trust. But that's reduced conveyance to hospital, we believe, between 3 and 5%. Now, it doesn't sound very much, but incrementally it makes a big difference. And if that saves 30 to 60 minutes for every patient, actually that's a massive impact, because that frees up an ambulance 60 minutes quicker than it would have done if they've conveyed. So therefore, by working smarter, harder, it was smarter and differently, it's not about working harder, it's actually then enabling us to work differently within the communities, keeping people in the right place, because actually it's about that spectrum into wellness again. Ross, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So, I mean, look, I'd agree. I think what we're talking to you about today is some of those, I guess I'd badge as tactical actions, as Marcus describes, things that the system is doing, that the ICB is supporting about how do we manage the pressure today. But you're absolutely right. You know, one of the key things around the ICB and coming together as an ICS is we start to look much further out at the wider public sector. So I think in terms of the strategy, yes, absolutely, there is a workforce strategy, but it's acknowledging some of the challenges we have in Norfolk and Waveney about attracting and keeping staff. Even though we've got really good university here, you know, we struggle to then keep those people that qualify. They often, certainly local people, use university as a route out of Norfolk and Waveney, but it's how do we look at those strategic approaches to encourage them back and to keep them once they're trained. So that's about providers working together, some of the things that Marcus talked about sharing rotational posts, all of those things that sit within your kind of your workforce strategy. And yes, it's not always about more. It's about how we use differently and the use of technology. I think the other thing in terms of a strategic approach, it is how we absolutely kind of look at population health. So how we work with partners like the ambulance service, our primary care colleagues, community. How do we keep people well for longer? How do we start to use public health data and wider public services, districts, colleagues, you know, housing, education, all of those things contribute to people's overall health and well-being, and hopefully we can then reduce the number of times people go into crisis. So I think one of the things I often talk about is that urgent and emergency care is often a symptom of other things that aren't working as well as they could in a wider system, and they show up then in people accessing urgent and emergency care because they have a need, and we haven't been able to address that need as a wider public sector before they get into crisis. So I think the ICS and the ICB is how we bring some of those, the power of the joint public sector together to get a bit further upstream, to work with populations on how we keep people well for longer, to reduce that demand both on health and social care. So I think that's really key. So there is a combination of those kind of longer term pieces of work. I think, again, just to say, there's the other side of this is, again, we've come out of the pandemic with very long elective waiting lists. So an absolutely critical part of the work the system is absolutely looking to do is to bring down those waiting lists as quickly as possible. And obviously that's quite rightly being driven nationally. But again, there's a recognition that we need to keep those elective pathways going, because again, people that are on long elective pathways again can often become unwell, and then they will end up being treated in an unplanned way. So there's strategies around how do we make sure that we bring down those elective waiting lists. Increasingly, we're building on the work of the ICS, which again is only coming to being relatively recently, about the new place boards and how we work much closer together in order to keep people well for longer. And I guess then those sort of more tactical things and the investments we can make in the shorter and medium term help us to get to that place where we would see a reduction in well, is it a reduction in demand? Actually, it may be a reduction in demand for urgent and emergency care, but the need of the population still exists, doesn't it? It's how we respond to that in an appropriate way. But, you know, again, we between Marcus and I, we could probably get into quite a lot of detail, but I think, yes, there are absolutely things that we're doing to look at all of those longer term strategic things. And I think that's really where the ICS starts to add value.
Would you recognise, Ross, that you've mentioned meeting the need, but would you also recognise that perhaps it's about meeting expectations and even managing those expectations at the front end?
I think that's absolutely key. And I think one of the things we would acknowledge that we haven't done well is about how we communicate with populations and the general public. And I think actually I'd extend that out to staff as well. I think our staff are under a lot of pressure. They're tired. They're working really hard in order to manage. None of our staff like to see situations where patients' needs can't be met. You know, nobody in an emergency department likes to see patients stuck that can't be admitted for long periods of time. Ambulance colleagues don't want to be sat outside a hospital. So I think there is work being done to look at how do we improve our communication as an ICS, not just to the public about what we're doing, and I guess this is part of it, isn't it, how we come and talk to colleagues such as yourselves, but also how do we get those messages out to staff as well, who can often feel you know, in individual teams or as individuals quite isolated. So I think that's a point well made, that we would acknowledge we could do better.
Okay, thanks for that. We may come back to that later, actually. I've got another question from Councillor Fredericks.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm ward member for Munsley up on the coast, and we have 2 incredible first responders. And I hear that you're giving consideration to giving them more money for their mileage. But I think you're really missing a trick here, because they keep people in the community and keep a lot of your patients at home, which is fantastic. Now, the fire service give a retain payment. Why can't that be rolled out to community first responders? You'd get more people signing up, because our community responders have to do other jobs. They're retired. There's a limit to what they can do. But surely if we had a retained service that's properly funded, they have to fundraise for their courses, their books, even their books and their equipment. Surely it would be better to place the investment in the heart of the community, where people can actually stay in their homes and keep well. So, you know, I'd really like you to consider that. And also I'd like to thank you for and all the staff for their exemplary service in the last 2 years. I had experience of your staff a couple of weeks ago, and I was actually in Suffolk at the time, and they were exemplary. They were absolutely amazing. So under very difficult conditions. So I'd really like to thank you. Thank you.
Would you like to come back on that, Marcus, in regard to retainers?
Yeah, thank you, and I hope you are well following our attendance from that, and I'm grateful for your kind words. And it just made me think when we did our long service award, and I appreciate we've had COVID. You know, we did 2 events where, with volunteers and our staff, we gave out certificates for nearly 5,000 years of service to our communities. That's a phenomenal achievement across east of England, and something that Ross picked up on. We should never underestimate the decisions that we make as leaders, and I'm a clinician by background, so I'm a paramedic and a nurse. So, you know, it still comes back down to when I first walked in 1998 about the why I did the job that I do. So we should never lose sight of that. I think, coming back to one of the councillors' earlier points about community responders, and so look, I don't disagree, and I know that we are sharing some conversations with Norfolk Fire and Rescue about that, because the benefit of an on-call or retained, with the benefit also comes some disbenefits and some challenges. And I think for us, we'd always viewed the use of community first responders, particularly in that defibrillator to the side of the patient, as quickly as possible. Now that has changed, and that's modified over time, because you start to look at risk and benefit in a slightly different way, and particularly around the feedback from our CFRs in things such as community falls and their ability to want to help people in a timely manner. Now, what we do know is that our first step should be, and I think to answer your question, we have to do this incrementally, is how we look. So number one is, let's see if we can support through things such as mileage, because I think that's the right thing to do, because we know that is a barrier and that is a challenge for people, whether employed, not employed, retired. You know, it does put a squeeze when you are doing a number of miles in there. I think what we also know is that our CFRs can arrive quickly, but also spend some time, because we do need ambulances. So there has to be a incremental bit of putting more ambulances on the road to support. And then longer term, very much about how do we build our volunteering strategy and working with the fire and rescue service. You think about the RNLI, you think about the opportunity to work with independent lifeboats, and the models that go through that is, what does a community in rural areas look like? But I'm very keen, and I'm sure as a committee you would want to make sure that we also balance our paid staff, so we know we can guarantee, versus on-call stroke volunteering, and you've got to get a balance between both of those. But I think hopefully from just kind of the conversation is we do recognise the value that community responders, we know that upskilling, because it's what they would like to do. We also know that we have to think differently about volunteering, particularly around some of the funding, and we've used a lot of our charity funds to be able to support that, and we've also used and accessed over £250,000 of NHS Together money as well for volunteering, and we've seen that being able to support in the response cars. The other bit for us is we're also doing some work with Norfolk Accident Rescue Service to test that relationship of volunteering and actually how we can support some of that with regards to paid position and paid time. So actually the combination of a charity and an NHS trust working together to provide care, both from volunteering and also placing critical care paramedics on the vehicles from our trust employed staff. So all of those are small signs and small steps that we take forward to say, absolutely with your point, but it's incremental, I would say, but something that's absolutely within our sights to say, how do we do that more community sustained volunteer stroke on call as we move forward.
You happy with that? Thank you. Right. Can I just ask you to, I may have missed it, but I wonder if there's more that might be said about the blockages in moving patients on into the care setting. So this is out of the hospital beds, and the extent to which hospital bed blocking is affecting the stacking up of ambulances. Is there more that you'd like to say about that, Ross?
Yeah, happy to, and I think Marcus would also be good to bring Marcus in as well. But I think you're absolutely right. I guess as we're working in a system, aren't we? So therefore, as a system, there are it's multifactorial in terms of why we end up in the position that we're in. But I think it's also dangerous to try and point almost a finger or trying to portion the cause to one thing. So I think there are a number of contributory factors to why we're seeing those right through to the risk in the community. So again, not speaking for Marcus, but we know there's a direct correlation between ambulance handover delays, because it takes crews off the road, and then their ability to respond to patients, and hence those tactical things we're doing, as well as the longer term pieces of work and those test of change pilots to try and reduce that. But you're absolutely right. Once we get into the inside the hospital, then there are a number of other things that start to impact. Staffing will be one, and you've already talked about that, and absolutely some of the challenges for us is then how do we think differently about the workforce. So just picking up the point about CFRs, we know following the pandemic, we've done a lot of work as a system with reservists. So we've never had a reservist workforce in quite the same way as we have now, but we're able to deploy a reservist workforce quite quickly. And those reservists come in as part and to flexible part of the paid workforce. So we're able to then use them flexibly in different parts, either at the front door or in some parts supporting the hospital. So that's again another area that we've built on from the work we did during the pandemic. But I think once we then get into the hospital, at the moment, one of our challenges is around that the hospital occupancy has remained high for some considerable time. And it's a combination of staffing pressures, but also dealing with infection prevention control issues, which have been further exacerbated. So we've seen COVID numbers rise again, because within a hospital, you've then got to keep those patients safe, and you'll be keeping different patient cohorts and groups separate. That obviously increases the amount of time and how efficiently, I guess, the use of beds are used across the hospital system. So there will be issues in the way the hospitals work and are able to work that will increase the length of stay. And of course, you're right, then there will be an impact on some of the challenges that Marcus described around workforce in general. The increase in costs means we're seeing domiciliary care is really stretched and challenged. So smaller agencies are seeing handing back packages of care because their staff can't afford fuel. So there's an issue around the social care support that then has a knock-on effect in terms of how quickly can we discharge patients safely back home. I think one of the key things to that, and there's been a real focus from our chief execs of late, is around a move towards home first. And I think during the pandemic, we were obviously trying to manage and work under extreme pressure, but I think we can lose sight of it's really important to get people back home. It isn't always the answer then to move people into other bedded solutions, and we saw some of those things happening through the pandemic. So there's a real focus now on how we get people safely home first, and how we use some of those already stretched health resources to support social care colleagues, because they equally have a significant proportion of unmet need in terms of social care. So again, it's this kind of system approach to it, and how we work together to manage the challenges kind of outside of the hospital once people are discharged, in the same way as we're looking at it with the ambulance service and community colleagues pre-hospital. But yes, there will be an impact of some of the challenges that social care also is having to deal with that will have a knock-on effect. There has recently been some additional investment that the system has gone at risk to increase capacity. So we're looking at where it's appropriate and supported by the community providers, some additional beds where people can go for reablement who need a bed, but also looking at some innovative solutions with our community providers about how might we support the domiciliary care market with some of our teams that work outside of the hospital, so that we can again safely discharge patients home, but make sure we provide the right wraparound support to those patients, so that they don't become deconditioned and we almost sort of lock in long-term care. So again, in a similar way that we describe working with Marcus pre-hospital, the same sorts of approaches, test of change, pilots, some additional investment is also looking at how we support the discharge from hospital, because that whole kind of flow of patients moving through is a challenge. And I think, again, it's you're quite right. The challenge back to us is then you need to have those longer term strategic aims in order to change the nature and the way in which we work as a health and social care system and with the public sector overall, to keep people well, so that they access the right service when they need it. But equally, we hopefully reduce or at least maintain the levels of demand on health and social care. But again, I can go into sort of a bit more specifics, but in general, happy to take any questions.
No, that's fine. That's understood. I think what we certainly would like to hear more of is that strategic approach in solving that intermediate care, releasing patients into a safe home setting, and I think what we're probably hearing at the moment are measures which I would perhaps regard more as firefighting rather than fire prevention, or stopping that at its cause rather than the effect. So I think it would be useful to have from you at some stage, when that's a bit more developed, how you are going to strategically tackle that. I'll just pause at that moment because I know Councillor Housen has got his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's actually sort of part of your question, really. In our papers we have today for this meeting, we've got an age profile of Norfolk residents, and basically those over 65 are as good as twice the national average. And given what our chairman has just raised, what is the planning in the context of the age profile of Norfolk, which is so high for those over 65? Because that must be both, to use a horrible phrase, a bed blocking issue, a further sort of services issue, and it's something that I can't see how you're going to kind of clear that, because the age structures, the age profile is not going to drop. If anything, it's going to increase, and therefore the pressure is going to be higher.
I think you're right. It's something is well known. So as part of our overall planning processes, we take account of population demographics. So the services that have previously commissioned by the CCGs, and then when we came together as one, would have been to take account of that age demographic. So you won't be surprised, hopefully, to know that we look at public health data, we look at pockets of deprivation, and we obviously plan to commission services around those populations. I guess there's some other context to this around one of the things we are and have been looking at quite closely is this difference between urgent and emergency care. So we often talk about our hospital colleagues, and we talk about some of the challenges they have. But when you look at urgent care overall, over 80% of urgent care is managed in primary care. It's probably less than 3% of urgent care activities managed through our emergency departments. And what we're looking at is how do we then work with our primary care colleagues and this population health approach? How do we keep people well? But equally, when they do need a service, if it is a hospital, if it is a bed, we need to make sure that we've got those beds available. But it doesn't necessarily always mean more. I think what we've seen through some of those test of change projects that then we develop into our more sort of longer term strategic approach is how we can develop new and different services in the community, working with primary care, working with those populations to provide services to keep people well and healthy. I think equally, I'm not a GP, but work closely with GP colleagues. They will tell you, and I'm sure Councillor Holliday will say the same. Frailty is not directly related to age. You can reverse frailty. So actually it's working with, again, those primary care and population colleagues to look at ways in which we keep people well and ensure that we are monitoring and managing people with long-term conditions, but also helping to prevent some of those long-term conditions. So it absolutely, we look at the demographic and as a system plan to deliver services around that population, but it is going up. So our age profile continues to change, and it is, as you say, more in the higher age groups. And clearly that will mean a slight change in services for us than it will for other parts of the country. But again, as Marcus has described, some of those test of change approaches, how providers come together to work at services, how we don't overlap services. So I think we probably have in the past commissioned things where we'll have effectively overlapped services. We've not made best use of the resources that we have. And I think what we're seeing as the RCS is those providers coming together will help us to develop those longer term solutions rather than it being a commissioning, entirely a commissioning approach. It is the power of those providers coming together and testing those different ways of working that will then design new services as we go forward. But again, happy to get into a bit more detail about specific things if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that probably is, yes. I'm getting a nod of assurance from Councillor Housden on that. So, General, I'm aware that you've generously given us an hour of your time, your valuable time, and I'd like to try and draw this to a conclusion if I can. And I'd like to try and do that on a positive note, because we've been firing a lot of questions towards you, and I'd like to think that perhaps there might be something that you might look towards us as being able to do. I'm just mindful that there's 40 councillors within this local authority, and we go out to each and every one of the parishes across North Norfolk District Council area. And that, of course, is where one of your principal hotspots is as far as response times goes. So I'm just going to put a further question to you, really, and this is about how can we perhaps change some of the things that we may do in connecting with our parishes and our town councils to try to add width to your efforts and value to what you do in the future. And one of the things that we did mention a little while ago, and I said we'd park it and I'd come back to it, is the matter of recruiting community first responders and the kind of message that we might be able to echo within the parish forums that we visit. And I just wonder if there's something that you, even if you're not able to say something now, whether you'd like to think about that and come back to us with perhaps a suggestion of how we might be able to contribute to your overall efforts, because we're not looking to you solely to solve these problems. We are a part of those problems, and we can perhaps add something to what you do already.
Marcus, do you want me to have a go first?
If you would like to lead off, Ross, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you, and I welcome that, and I think Councillor Holliday and I meet reasonably regularly, and I think actually some of the things we've talked through with Councillor Holliday and her group is around the support that, again, coming at it from those sort of more pragmatic solutions. We tried to work quite closely with the group around things like our summer plans. So we know we have an influx of vacationers, don't we, coming into our patch, and actually Councillor Holliday and the group were really helpful to us last year in terms of developing those plans. We've lost a bit of momentum, I think. We picked up with Councillor Holliday the other day, and I think we're going to agree to kind of pick that up again. So I think there's some really practical things, as you say, around engaging local communities to look at the ways we communicate messages, because actually we need to think carefully about how we get some of those messages out around self-care, but also around the services that are available that people can access. Again, those would be the areas where I think we could continue dialogue with you. And I suppose from a more strategic point of view, as we begin to see the ICS place boards develop, that obviously is a really important forum then to engage within those more strategic pieces of work, where we would look at things like that demographic data, look at the services and the footprint of services in your particular district, to look at how we, I guess, design those services more effectively with the local population. So I think there are some, most definitely, both from a strategic point of view, but also from some real practical things we can do with you around getting important messages out and helping us to shape messages as well as services. But I don't know if there's anything else you'd want to add to that, Marcus.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I was just going to build probably a little bit on that, because I think the two things that struck to mind, and I'm very grateful for the offer. As said, it's about us looking after our communities together. So I think I would angle to, one is the public health and promotion side. So I think there is something for us about the messages to which we can share, the conversations to which we can have, and the thoughts that perhaps, if we never start having a conversation about influencing how people support themselves, we will never have it, and that needs to be reinforced by everybody. It's not just a health message, because actually it's about wellness, it's about everything that Ross was speaking about, and I was writing down everything. So I think that would be really good. It's almost that truly fostering and understanding that community conversation, and assisting people to be well, not unwell. And I think that's something that I think we could really explore. And the other one, when we talk about recruitment of CFRs, I think it'd be really good, linking back to the conversation, that the opportunity to signpost people to a range of recruitment opportunities would be really, really good. So we know that actually, if we were able to increase recruitment to social care, would have a really big impact. But we very rarely talk about recruiting as a pathway of choice into social care. So actually the opportunity to influence head teachers, to be able to influence, job centre, the whole thing when we're speaking with communities, I think would be really, really powerful as well. And I'm sure that we can link up for members with the right information, the contact details, to be able to signpost and support that. But they would be two really practical ones. So strategically workforce and strategically public health, I think would work. I think would add real value. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much for for that. That gives us, I think, something to think about there, and I think we'd like to kind of see that as a very positive and constructive relationship that we can perhaps work on more in the future. I'm just going to throw the questions open if there are any tail enders. No, I don't see any. Oh, Councillor Holliday.
I'm conscious we've done quite a lot of work with the North Norfolk Ambulance Response Working Group, but we could broaden out the initiatives that we've had more widely, because we have actually had discussions. I mean, the one thing we didn't cover just now, Ross, was the support that the community can give to patients as they come out of hospital, and there's some very discrete support mechanisms that you have structured, which we could fit into. And I think we could do a better job of that. So I could broaden out the information that I have to the rest of the group. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed, both of you, for your time and your contribution. I think we've covered the questions either in your written responses or in your verbal responses today. And I hope that we can have perhaps an ongoing dialogue. And I think you ought to go away with the message to perhaps understand that whilst we are here to represent our communities and will clearly want to hold service deliverers to account, we are also recognise that we are part of this overall solution and would want to play our part for the future. And as I think you've said a time or two, we can't go on doing more of the same, only working harder. We've got to do something different to change the model. And we've got to be thinking about what those capacity challenges are for the future. So we've got that on our minds as well. So I'd like you to go away with that kind of recognition that this isn't all about, you know, knocking and beating a path to your door. Okay, I see no further hands raised. So thank you very much indeed, both of you, for your contribution today. And we'll build on that relationship in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Right. Okay. So if we can then move on to item 11, I think. Oh, are we technically required to sort of note that, Matt?
Yes. I suppose so.
Are you content to note that conversation that we've had and some of the actions that will hopefully flow into improvements of the future? Okay, thank you very much indeed. So moving on to item 11 then. This is the councillor call for action. This is the impact of the second homes and holiday lets data report. Before I ask for introduction on this, I'm mindful that we've had a lot of officer input on this, and we've had what I think is a very fulsome and informative report prepared for us today. Who would like to lead off?
Just note that John Toy is the seconder. Liz is giving her apologies today, so I'll pass it over to him.
Well, Councillor Toy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as people draw breath, if I must do one thing, you and I share a similar military history, and from the same, and when there is a comms issue and the comms controller goes standby one, it gives you a very warm and comfortable flashback. So thank you for that this morning. You can take the man out of the military.
You'll have to forgive me for that.
But not the military out the man. So I enjoyed that very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so thank you, Chair and the committee, for following up on the call for action, which was requested. I also thank you for taking the time to work through the report and understand the conclusions. As you have done, Mr. Chairman, must give the biggest thanks to officers who have worked through the massive amounts of data and documents, links and press articles to get this report to us today in a format that makes it easy to understand. This work has been truly amazing and should be commended. I'd also like to note personally that responses from members was disappointing, with only a few engaging with data and reports to be considered by officers. Considering this was potentially about how we make homes more affordable for our residents, it was disappointing. I hope that the committee would encourage the opportunity for members to have a briefing from Professor Christian Hilber, which has been offered for a question and answer session on second homes. I think Matt will give you some more information on that in a while. As has been discussed in this committee, this was done without preconditions or perception and based on the best available data. I do not intend to go into the details in the report, which you have, which you will have, but I believe that as shown in the report in Appendix S3 in particular, that we must be careful not to make decisions with unintended consequences. As has been shown with St Ives, who put restrictions on new build homes as second homes in May 2016, 6 years ago, recent reports have shown that the situation is no better and that existing home prices have increased. Less new homes have been built, there have been adverse effects on the local economy. There are less affordable houses for would-be first-time buyers and less construction of new affordable homes. Investors have been more likely to buy up existing homes and making it more like a ghost town and not less. Many of the concerns around second and holiday homes appear to be that people felt it restricts the availability for local housing for local people. The data from this extensive report does not on balance support that notion. Indeed, in many cases, it can be a benefit, as has been shown in Wales, where the value of market housing improves viability and delivers a percentage of more affordable homes. There was a report by the Welsh government that also showed that restricting occupancy of new build homes attracted more retirees and the extra strain that can put on resources, as has been discussed this morning. We've already got issues there. Additionally, there appears to be no evidence that loss of local facilities is affected by second and holiday homes. This is happening universally. Having read the report and many other documents, I believe if we are to see affordable homes for people locally and through the country, we need to see a fundamental shift in government policies, which would require a separate report and actions. We have a system that has sold most of the housing stock without reinvestment. Between 1945 and 1980, the country built 4.4 million houses, 126,000 a year. After the right to buy changes in 1980, the next 3 years, we built 44,000 social houses. Last year, nationally, housing associations delivered 4,250 socially rented homes with 1.6 million people on waiting lists. A 40-year experiment with ownership that, in my opinion, has failed many people and benefited a few. The private letting market is collapsing, 50% reduction this year due to changing government tax incentive rules. People are now facing average rents of around £1,200, and news just yesterday that some landlords are now asking for one whole year's rent as a deposit. We spend 21 billion as a nation supporting private rented accommodation. Growing wealth inequality, all in the report, an inflexible and dysfunctional land-based planning system, a tax system that provides virtually no incentive to local authorities to permit residential development. Getting to the realities of a housing system in all its forms that is not suitable for current and future generations of the whole population is a separate challenge that will not be addressed through the limited and potential counterproductive control of second homes. At the bottom of Appendix F2, banning the construction of new second homes or imposing transaction taxes may be politically popular policy in the short run, but they don't do anything to cure the underlying causes of the problem. It seems to me on this evidence that we need to change the narrative from second homes and holiday homes are bad to understanding the benefits they bring with the right controls. The same as we've spoken about with the ambulance service is about understanding it properly. There are some things that the government are proposing that will help to improve the safety for visitors, hence the recommendations in this report, and I believe should be supported. Whilst we must look to North Norfolk and continue the best we can with the current rules, we are delivering through our comprehensive housing strategy and a new local plan and its policies. But without fundamental change to primary legislation, we will struggle to deliver real housing and affordable end. So the report is about holiday homes and second homes, but I felt I should give that information around it. Reporting its findings in front of you, and I guess I'm going to hand over to officers now who can actually take you through the report and their findings.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Councillor Toy. I think you've actually covered a lot of the touch points in the report, and I'm just a little reluctant to ask officers to take us through the report because we should have actually read it already, and I regard officers being here as there to take questions. So unless they're really straining at the leash to point something of great significance, then I think we'll leave it at that, and I'll throw it open to questions. So questions, Councillor Blathwaite.
Yeah, I was just amazed by this report. I think it's I'm surprised by it, and I find it a fantastic piece of work. But I would just like to ask, is there any way of recording Section 21 orders within the North Norfolk district, so we know how many people are being evicted through no fault of their own for their accommodation to be turned into holiday homes? Thank you.
Officers. Who'd like to leave? Nikki?
I can partially answer that question. I don't honestly know the answer to whether we have the total figure of Section 21 notices, but I can certainly go and find that out. What we do have is figures around the number of households presenting as homeless as a result of Section 21 notices, which has gone up. We don't necessarily know whether that's because their property has gone as a second home. What you'll see from the national findings is the vast majority of reasons for leaving the private rented sector aren't about moving towards short-term lets. They're about a whole host of factors, primarily, I imagine, about the state of the housing market and the value of a home when it can be sold. But there have been changes to the tax system. There are obviously the government's proposals to end Section 21 notices. There's a 2-year period of COVID when nobody was being evicted, and yet several tenants were running up arrears. So tax changes that have made it less attractive to be a landlord. There's a whole host of issues that are happening in the private rented sector that are leading, we believe, to a national decline, and we keenly await the results from the census to see what those figures really look like.
You continue with that.
Yes, thank you. I would like to see some recording of Section 21s within the district. I don't know how that can be achieved, but I know it's a real issue.
Okay, is that something you can take away, Nikki? Thank you. Councillor Toy.
Yeah, just part of that, I think, it's in the report. I can't remember exactly where, but it's something like 84, 85% of the houses have been sold and not converted to short-term lets and things like that. So the vast majority are being sold. They're moving out of the market.
Okay. Well, we've got some significant recommendations ahead of us here, but so before we turn to those, are there any other questions, Councillor Cushing?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too would like to reiterate my congratulations. I think it's absolutely superb piece of work that you've done. So well done. Jam-packed full of really interesting and information. I do think we give some credit to the government for at least recognising the issue and proposing legislation around this particular area. But I do take the point that Councillor Toy makes. Actually, I think though there are extra powers being granted to local authorities, I do think we need to give really serious consideration to what the consequences of that would be if we were to implement them. What the report, I think, really brings out very well is it's not a black and white issue at all. There's lots of shades of grey in here, and I do think we do need to consider very carefully what we would do with that. So I'm happy to support recommendations. There is one piece of information I would be interested in. I don't know whether we're able to get that. If we look at the number of holiday homes and second homes, are we able to split that into council tax categories? I mean, the perception is that second homes are all bad. Now, if you're looking at affordable homes, one assumes that affordable homes are going to be in the council tax bands A to D. I just wonder if we have a feeling on how many of those are sort of in that category.
I don't have the data to hand, but yes, we can get that for second homes. For holiday homes, not so easy because they're obviously classed as business rates. Yeah, we may be able to look at what they were before, but it depends how long.
If it's just easy for second home, that would be, I think that'd be an interesting piece of information for us to have a look at.
Can provide that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Are there any other questions that Councillor Hauser?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm thinking of a question because I can't quite formulate it in my head. I have a problem with second homes, but if we just put that to the side for the moment. In the popular coastal areas, obviously the second homes are a benefit to the communities in the terms of trade and revenue to those communities. But staggeringly, if you look at West Raynham in these figures, and there are other villages, second homes have absolutely decimated. I think we may have touched on the fact that West Raynham School had to close. And this has happened in numerous schools where the communities do not have the cachet that the coastal communities have. And I know what Councillor Cushing has just said regarding central government and planning, but maybe is there something we can do in those communities? Because it's there that the second homes are having the biggest impact. The pubs shut, the schools shut, the bus services just drop away, and yet there is still a residual population that's pretty isolated. I don't know the answer, but I just wonder if there's something that we should be looking at. I mean, it is a good report, but that definitive distance between, let's just take Wells for the moment and West Raynham, it's a tragedy. What happens? And that school should have been kept open, but there's just not the pupils to support it. So I don't know what we can do, and I don't even know what the question is, but I just see it as a huge issue.
I think you raise a very legitimate issue. I don't have a specific answer myself to it. I have a generic answer, and that is I think that we probably have some more work to do to be able to identify how best we can play into that, which I guess takes me to really what I see in front of us here now is that we've got two levels of measures that seem to be in play here, or potentially in play. We've got a sort of central government primary legislation, secondary legislation level in setting the national context to what we as a local authority can do, and the kind of powers that we see as being helpful. And there may well be some lobbying efforts and genuine proposals that we want to make towards central government to bring those about. So that's that sort of top level, if you like. And then we've got at the local level, we've got some things that we, as I think, as a district council, as a housing authority, a planning authority, need to think about as well, about what we can do to begin that mitigation process. So I guess I'm coming back to what's the thrust of the councillor call for action, in a sense, because that's at the heart of this, isn't it? Yourself and Councillor Withington are the proposers of this. This is the first sort of significant response to that. And what do you want to see as, or what do you think are the likely sort of outcomes that might be achievable in the not too distant future? I kind of put that back to you, Councillor Blathwaite.
I'm happy to take that, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, it's a subject that was talked by many, and hence my disappointment with the amount of engagement that I felt we got back. It was a conversation that was going on everywhere, in corridors, in meetings. And there is this, that second homes takes affordable homes away. Now, we went into this open mind and said, what's the reality? What do we need to mitigate? We've talked about the safety of people that rent properties as well, our visitors that come here, because there's lots of mechanisms that need to be put in place for that, hence some of the recommendations. But we went into it open-minded to find out what is the reality. And what you have in front of you today is the reality. And the reality is that second homes don't get rid of schools. They don't close post offices. It's happening universally. It's not, in fact, they're more likely to stay open with second homes because those people will go to the local shop and not off to the supermarket. So actually, it's counter to what we think in the main. There'll always be pockets, and it's a large area, and we've got, large numbers, but we've seen where people have tried some of the things that are available to us, the restriction on new homes, because we can't do anything about those that are there. And again, evidenced in the report is actually, if we put that restriction on new build homes to a primary residence only, that gives us the affordable element off of that, because they won't be affordable unless it's an exception scheme. But what that does is it puts the value of the other houses up. So the people with the second homes and already living there are the ones that gain by it, not the people for affordable homes. And we get more retirees. So that's what this report has delivered to you today, is that story. And hence my introduction saying that the thing that people felt it was about being affordable homes, which is what we need. As I said, the numbers, 4,000 homes a year delivered with 1.6 million on a waiting list. It's not enough. I know the government talk about 300,000, but then we get neutrality thrown in. There's a whole thing, it's not a simple answer. The reality is, as I say, we can only do what we can do within terms of what's available, and suggestions in the recommendations given you today, the ones that are coming down the line that we think we should support, they are the ones that we can do within the terms that are there. The next question is, what do we as a council want to do about delivering more affordable homes? Remember, affordable is not just purchasing, it's the rent as well. It's can people afford to rent them? Because this collapse in the rental market has made that fall away. There is less there now. People need to pay more, they need to be bigger deposits. It's made that impossible. And we're having to support that. We're having to support those people and find them accommodation and pay for it. So it needs a solution. We don't have any tools in the toolkit, having done this investigation, to do any more than we're suggesting here, which we believe won't have unintended consequences, as has been seen elsewhere. So I don't know if I'm getting to the answer for your question there, Mr. Chairman, but I think the report is a surprise to many. We felt that it was making places ghost towns and losing facilities and that because of it, but actually the evidence doesn't stack up with that. It actually improves employment. The evidence is there that actually, in a controlled way, and hence the recommendation to support the doubling of council tax, in a controlled way, they're actually a benefit to communities because they can, as a percentage, deliver more affordable housing. But there is a bigger question that we need to decide as a council, how we need to address central government and the changes we would like to see them make so that we can deliver what we want for our communities.
Okay.
Hopefully I've got there.
Thank you for that. I've got, I think, 2 questions, possibly 3 now. Councillor Fredericks, Councillor Housing, and Councillor Seawood.
Thank you. Again, I would like to praise the officers for putting this together. What a detailed piece of work. This is amazing. On affordable housing, we need land. We need government money to do this. We can't just magic it out of nowhere. So that's my message. We need land, we need provisions to do so, and the housing associations also need support on that as well. And our officers do a really fine job in enabling the affordable housing that we've built and are continuing to build. But we need more help. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Housden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have to take issue with one point. I have direct experience of living 2 properties amongst 13, 11 were second homes. And when the second home people came up, Tesco's vans followed them an hour later and nothing went back into the community because there wasn't a community shop and the pub closed. Just thinking about how this could be addressed by this council, I think we've got sort of 4 issues. We've got affordable housing, we've got the private rented sector, we've got the issue of second homes, and we can't challenge that in its entirety. And we've got geographical location. And to me, what I think we should focus on is those communities in the geographical areas which are being denuded by the increase of second homes and where maybe there's a land allocation. And in my ward, there's one particular landowner who is trying to counter this, particularly with the closure of the village school. And so I think perhaps we've got to take a slightly different approach. Rather than starting with the second homes, maybe we need to start at the bottom, looking at what our land resources, which Councillor Fredericks has just mentioned, might be in various locations, and particularly those locations that aren't the prime areas of coastal demand. And it's interesting that map of Norfolk District Council has Rainham as the green area, and I bet I won't be able to pick it straight up. But the bulk really is centred Burnham Market, Wells, Morstan, Stiffkey, that area. And I just think maybe we need to look at it as strategically, geographically, private rented and affordable housing.
Okay, I think that probably is similar to my own thoughts in a sense that what we've done so far, I think has been at sort of district council, district-wide level. And I wonder if there's a further piece of work that needs to be done with town and parish councils, because what we've got in Wells is one situation. What we've got in Brumstead, and Brumstead doesn't have one second home or a holiday let, is very different. And somewhere there's a whole shade of differences. And I wonder if there is a further piece of work to engage town and parish councils in, because we're having this discussion here and we're at district level, and okay, we're representative of our parishes, but we're not truly reflecting, I don't think, because we don't have that full ability to engage with the town and parish councils to the extent that they perhaps have an input to this. So across our, however many 100 and whatever there are town and parish councils across the district, I think that there will be some that will have some particular views that they think that in their location, something, a particular measure would be helpful. Elsewhere, that may not be the case at all. They may take a very different view. So I don't know whether there is to me, there isn't one size that fits all. So I think there is a tailoring job to be done at some stage when we consider what we want to do and where we want to do it. Councillor Toy.
Yeah, just to fill in on that, I agree. We need to make sure that it's reality, not perception, which has been, I think, some of the interesting learning from this. There was a perception, the reality proves to be somewhat different. But again, I hate to go back to it, but members have known this has been going on. They've been going to their parish councils. They've had an opportunity to get input from them to feed into this, and they've not taken that opportunity. And that was why my disappointment, because that opportunity was open and reminded by Matt a few times to people, requiring that input. And that's what we needed to give that granular stuff through the district. So if we have to go back and do that, that's fine. I also believe there has been an opportunity to do that.
So if members hadn't done that, we have the means at a press of a button to basically put this on the agenda of every town and parish council across the district, if you want. Yeah, that doesn't require much action on the part of an officer, for example.
I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, Mr. Chairman. I'm just saying that there has been an opportunity, and it's a shame that we would have to do that
I think
work.
you've made your point in respect of perhaps members' contribution isn't what you would have expected it to be or hoped it might be.
It could have given us that granularity in those particular areas, that perspective for people. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Seward.
Thank you, Chairman. In terms of, as a North Walsham member, second homes is not an issue, particularly in our town, although they are appearing. In terms of involving town and parish councils, there's a town and parish forum. I don't know if this report's been there, but that would be a useful forum, I would have thought, for it to be seen and looked at. And I have to say, I have read it, and I found it a very comprehensive and factually detailed report, and thank the officers for that. In terms of, I just raised one or two things because it presumably will now go to the cabinet and what we have to look at. It's one that's part of the ongoing discussion. I do have some knowledge of Happisburgh, having been a county member there, and that is a village which there is more holiday lets. They're not being rented out to the housing market or being sold. The people that are moving into that village tend to be older people because they've got the money to afford the properties. There is a primary school there. It has about 100 pupils, so it's on a bit of a knife edge. If the number of families living in the vicinity of that school with children of primary school age reduces or remains static, by definition, that school is at risk. So the idea that second homes, by definition, don't affect schools, the movement we're taking place can do. What I have to say to counter that is that holiday lets and second homes in Happisburgh do keep a business going for the local pub, which, as you know, belongs to a member of this authority, and it also helps the community shop. But schools, it does put them in difficulty, and I have to agree with Councillor Houston. When I read this report, the village that came to my mind was Blakeney. So I started to think, what is it that we could do? Now, presumably the argument, as I would see it in Blakeney, that's coming from concern from people is, look, we were brought up in the area of Blakeney. Our families have always lived there. We're now priced out. There is no houses. And what does that do for the viability of the local community when you actually need shop assistants, when you need bar staff, you need people to collect bins, you need people to keep the streets clean, you need your plumbers, your bricklayers and so on. So it does start then to produce a problem in terms of the economic and social viability of these communities. And that to me is the nub of it. So the then issue is, what do you do? Well, I don't think the St Ives solution or putting a restriction on second homes in Blakeney is going to change the house prices. Because even if you said they've got to be reduced by half, what would actually happen? There's enough money in the market and enough people interested in living in Blakeney, they buy them up as permanent places to live. That's the crunching reality. So what you're back to is what can be done to increase the level of affordable homes in these kind of areas. Now, there are planning restrictions, and as I understand it, they remain in the new local plan, but there are exemption sites, and that's about having the money to buy the land. And if we wanted to say anything to the government in the Levelling Up bill, it seems to me that if we're going to have an increase in council tax for second home owners, then that money shouldn't go to the county council, because if it does, we only get 10 or 11p of it for every pound. But it should actually be retained by this council and ring-fenced to build up a fund to buy land. Because it's quite interesting, because Mr. Chairman of my age group, I don't always talk to people in their early 20s that often. But I have talked to two recently by purely casual accommodation. And it's quite marked. They both say to you, though they're in the housing market, what an awful struggle it is for younger people to get into the housing market. And they look at people like my generation and say, you're not helping us. It was all right for you. It's not for us. Now, there's a reason why it was easier for you and I, and it's not for them. And the reason for that is very rarely looked at, because it's a very uncomfortable story for politicians of all parties to grapple. But it does seem to me, if we're talking about recommendations, is that one of it in the Levelling Up bill is that we need to keep that extra revenue ring-fenced to build up money for land. And that to me is the crucial part of it. It's going to be a long struggle, but it's the cost of land that's driving up house prices. We always like to point the fingers at Persimmons or Hopkins. Well, yeah, they do make a return, but the people that really have done very well out of all this are those who are lucky enough to have the land to sell for housing, which is why when poor Mark Ashwell and his team have to start allocating land in new for housing, why there is such a scramble in the competition, because all of a sudden the land value of that land goes through the roof. So that I think is one thing. The other thing I noticed in recommendation 3 is that it talks about planning permission for second and holiday homes. I'm all in favour of housing lets being registered and tightening up in terms of ensuring they're of the required standard. I couldn't quite understand, and perhaps the officers could help, if you had planning permission for it to be a second home, how's that going to change it? Perhaps I've lost something, but perhaps the officers can help. Thank you, Chair.
So the current position, as explained in the report, is you've effectively got no levers to use to control change of use of existing properties. So you can change the use of a house to a holiday unit or a second home, no planning permission required. All the report is suggesting you do through the recommendations is support the introduction of those levers. Whether you choose to subsequently use them or not is up to you. So in the future, if planning permission was required for some forms of second home ownership or
change of use to holiday accommodation, you could come up with that patchwork quilt approach across the district where you have different policy approaches to whether you grant planning permission for those types of development or not. So you could say, we believe for whatever reason, Blakeney has reached its saturation point. There's far too many holiday units and second homes in Blakeney, and we want a restrictive planning policy to stop that continuing to happen. You'd have to evidence that and think about the consequences of introducing those controls. I'm not entirely persuaded myself, but at the moment you don't have that option because all of those changes of use are outside of our control, do not need planning permission at all. So all the report is saying is support the introduction of that additional lever and then subsequently decide whether you use it or not when you've got the evidence. And I think there were a couple of questions were asked as we went through that were interesting areas to explore. One was what council tax bands are most second homes in. Well, I think I understand the reason why that question was asked, that if they weren't second homes, would they become affordable houses? I think the answer to that is no. But to evidence that, you'd have to look at the council bans of properties which are currently being used as second homes, and you'd probably find they're very expensive, desirable properties, and imposing occupancy restrictions on them would have no impact at all on the delivery of second homes in that community. And the other notion that was put, the challenge was, if there were no second home owners in West Raynham, would all the houses be full of primary school children? Well, I think the answer to that question is also no, but we don't have the evidence to answer that question. Those two bits of evidence would be germane to your consideration as to whether you pulled those levers or not, whether you exercise those controls in the future. So I think you've got evidence that says where we are. You've got recommendations that say, let's support the introduction of additional controls. And then we're leaving that choice open in the future as to whether you do that or not through different local plan policies, or whether you ultimately choose to introduce additional tax options. None of which are recommended in the report. It's just saying let's support those legislation changes so that if we do choose to do something in the future and the evidence is there to support what we do that at that stage.
Okay, thank you for
I
that.
think that's where we are.
Does that respond to your point, Councillor Seward?
Yeah, it gives us the option. I'm not sure in many places it's going to change much, but it does give us the option. So I take that. It might be in some places, it might be of some benefit. It could, for example, if in North Walsham second homes became a real issue, we might put some controls on because the level of house prices, whilst they've gone up astronomically in the last 12 months, it's more likely to be a place where people will want to have a permanent place to live rather than be a second home. So I can just see that just might be an option. So I thank Mark Ashwell for that. I was just trying to work through.
Yeah, it's just at the moment, Eric.
There's a bit of working through to be done. There's no two ways about it. I'm just really wanted to make sure that, are you, in respect of the first point that you made with regard to what we do with the second homes, additional money, if you like, and how you might fund affordable land in the future, are you comfortable with recommendation 2? Is that sufficiently encompassing in generic terms? Because clearly we don't make decisions today, we make recommendations, and these will go forward to Cabinet. Cabinet is the decision-making body.
Sorry, John, I haven't got the thing. I think as a recommendation stands, it's pointing in a certain direction for the Cabinet. We may, when we discuss it, want to toughen it up a bit. But the general gist of where I was coming from and where I think Wendy Fredericks was coming from, and I think John Toy in his introduction and possibly Christopher Cushing as well. I don't want to put words into people's mouths, but I think that's the, when I just thought about this, it seems to me is a way forward. Okay, good. I'm just anxious that we've got a couple of more items to conclude, but I've got Councillor Blathwaite next, and Councillor Heinrich, and Councillor, did you want to speak? Yes, and Councillor Brown. So I'm going to close the list at that point. Can we be reasonably brief, please? So, Councillor Blathwaite.
Yeah, just to say, I did try and enthuse my parish councils to engage with this. I found a lot of anecdotal evidence that would go against the actual general findings of this report, but not a lot of factual. I would like to say that in one particular parish, Pauling, the anecdotal evidence was that, in fact, that the demographic has come down, and this they felt was something to do with holiday homes and the work around holiday homes and tourism in general. So that was an interesting intuitive anecdote. What I would like also to say is in Potter Heigham, we have a lot of holiday homes built as holiday homes and used hopefully as holiday homes. Unfortunately, I don't think they are used as holiday homes as much as they should be. I think they're used as primary residence. And my thing is, how do we police the 90 days of a business rate? And I think that is a crux that we need to investigate so we can be assured that business rates are being properly applied and that we are aware of the actual amount of people we have living in our parishes who aren't officially recognised because they are living in what is primarily supposed to be holiday homes. And I think that is an issue. Thank you.
I think you're right. And that I think plays into, there is more work to be done. I'm not sure that we want to be too specific about what that future work would be, because I think I would like to see personally these recommendations go into the cabinet arena and perhaps then further work be commissioned on a more focused basis. But so your point is well made, and I think we can probably carry that forward in that regard. Councillor Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. An excellent report that possibly raises more issues than it resolves at this stage. So I'm happy to support the recommendations.
What you wish for.
It seems to me that one issue we might need to explore further is relating to an ageing population, reducing young population, many of whom with skills will leave the district because the employment opportunities do not exist. Too much of the tourist trade involves low paid, low skill, often low skilled seasonal work. It's not permanent. Further, with an ageing population, there's going to be a greater demand for care. And we already know that care homes are desperate for staff. They just do not exist locally now. The ones who were, many who have since departed back to Poland and Portugal. We possibly need to look at these employment issues and how we deal with the ageing population. Now, that's a vast issue, I know, and it's far beyond this report, but it just highlights me that there is something else here that we need to look at alongside our current economic policy of trying to get more high-tech, high-paid jobs into the district. We've got that's another problem. It's maybe 10, 15 years down the line, long after I've retired totally. But it's just another question it throws up in my view. Thank you.
Another piece of work to be done.
Yes, Chairman, yet another piece of work. The more research, the better. Research gives us ideas, it gives us possible solutions, but it makes us think at least.
Yeah, I think that's right. Councillor Housen.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. First of all, very quickly, with the parish councils, there's a disconnect. It was discussed at two of mine, and they just don't feel there's anything they can do about it. They just feel utterly powerless, even reporting in. I'm afraid to say, you know, the tsunami which they see is something that's unstoppable because of the state of the economy, property prices and all the rest of it. But I think what I've just really wanted to say, I think both Councillor Seward's point about whether we can retain money in this district council for use in this district council on affordable housing. And I think the point that Mark has made about using leverages in different locations is critical, because that will help whether it is Blakeney restricting or whether it's West Raynham. I think that's a critical measure. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try and be fairly brief. It would be remiss of me not to say something as a new portfolio holder and the former member of this committee who commissioned this report. I thank the officers for all their work on this. I thank Councillor Toy for his walkthrough of the essence of it. This is a matter which local homes for local need, which is the flip side of second homes. Holiday lettings was in our corporate plan when we took over this administration and is a very, very important subject to us. It's also very complex, probably the most complex area that this council has to deal with. It's also complex for the government. I'm sure the leader of the opposition will listen to this with particular care when I say it's taxed all political persuasions down government for several years. We're now on the 16th housing minister since 2006, which tells its own story. There are a couple of elephants in the room, perhaps nationally, that we haven't touched on. One is the 1 million planning permissions which haven't been built out nationally. I'm not sure how many of those we have in North Norfolk. The reason why I mention that is that if we build more, it gives more fluidity in the housing market, and there is that restriction in terms of these permissions not being built out. Now, whether a development land tax, similar to what we've had in the past, would resolve that at government level, I don't know. The other thing is that the proposal to hike up council tax on holiday lets and second homes is certainly not going to work unless we have a registration system. We need to be able to track the changes in ownership in holiday lets and second homes much more accurately, perhaps not in the way that they do in South Suffolk, where they put a label on somebody's waste bin that it is a holiday let property. That's perhaps not the way to go, but they have addressed it in one way that perhaps we haven't so far. So just turning to recommendation 2, I would say that no, enabled doubling is not, in my view, the correct way to go. We should increase it, but we should reserve our right to increase by more than doubling. We could treble. The Welsh have introduced a quadrupling next year, which may be subject to a legal challenge at the moment, but at least that was their intention. And if I had to sort of vote on something that I would have put in the report, it is that study by the Welsh government, which was ostensibly concern over the declining Welsh language in communities, which prompted the study. But it was a very, very lucid and wide-ranging study in terms of it covering a number of authorities in Wales. So it was very useful in that respect. So I think what we need to do is also consider through the local plan, with my chair of the working party hat on, whether we should in fact have a metric above, say, 25% in certain areas where second homes are more prevalent than that, where we should consider tapering council tax levies in those particular areas if it's possible to do that. And certainly I am wholesome behind the proposal to retain that revenue. We see it with the new community levy in the levelling up bill, initially introducing the white paper, that should be kept locally. We see it with green infrastructure payments, that hopefully we're keeping it locally focused, and who knows, nutrient neutrality contributions for mitigation might go that way as well. So there's a trend there, so we definitely do need to do that. And I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, this is a platform. It's just a first step along the journey to making recommendations to the government, and when it goes to cabinet, we will be looking at these recommendations. If people want to change them now, along the lines of what I've suggested, I'm happy to propose that as an observer, not as a member, or we can leave it until it goes to cabinet. That's all I've got to say, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think we just need to be a little bit careful that we as a committee are making recommendations on the basis of the councillor calls for action and the material that's been put before us today. I think that we've heard many good ideas about further pieces of work that need to be done. I'm mindful that officer resource will be required in order for that extra work to be done. That's not a decision for this committee, that's a decision for Cabinet. So I would caution going too far down the road of firming up what needs to be done next, because actually that responsibility really rests with Cabinet. So I don't take anything away from what's being proposed in terms of what needs to be done next. But that's not the decision, I think, of this committee because of those resource implications. I think I would say that officers have done well in producing this report, bearing in mind it was an unscheduled piece of work in the kind of order of workload that's been, that's routinely placed upon them. So I don't think it's probably our role to add to that at the moment. I think we'd like to have that wider view because it's Cabinet really that needs to make that kind of decision. Just to close, before I finally close, Councillor Toy.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity. Just as someone who brought this to the committee as a seconder, I thank the committee for considering this. I thank them for the recommendations. Obviously, again, I'd like to thank the officers for the work. Clearly, there is more work to be done as this authority to find the next steps. And I think everybody understands that what we need is more of the right sort of housing. And restrictions on second homes are not going to produce the numbers that we need for people to live there. Even if we bring high-tech industry, which there is some coming to this area, there's still nowhere for people to live. And that in itself will present problems. I'm this afternoon out with the housing team where we're trying to encourage people to take 9 houses on an exception site. And of course, there will be local opposition, 9 houses. We know how that works. People need to understand the only way we're going to deal with this is to build houses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you for that. Can I just confirm then, from your point of view, on behalf of both yourself and Councillor Withington, whether you are content with what's presented here in terms of what your expectations were of your councillor call for action and the action and the handling of this by this committee? Are you content with that?
I am, Mr. Chairman, especially the fact that it's opened up these further steps now that we can continue to address this. So thank you. I appreciate the work for everybody.
Okay, thank you. Right, then we got these 5 recommendations before us.
Chairman, can I just add one point to those? Sorry, over here.
Oh, sorry.
Just in addition to the recommendation, something that was suggested by John, I think should be considered as an action, perhaps to add to those recommendations, is that Christian Hilber, one of the professors from the LSE whose study in Switzerland we referenced in the report, and the impact of kind of essentially banning second homes in Switzerland, has offered to provide members with a remote briefing, which would need to be before the term starts again at LSE. So just for members to give consideration if they would be supportive of arranging that in August sometime.
Well, you all heard that. Do you have a proposer for that? Councillor Blathwaite, seconder? You can't second. If you can speak though.
I was just going to raise a point for good order. There was reference to a letter that had been received that's not been mentioned today at all. And I think it ought to perhaps be minutes or at least noted that that letter was brought to your attention when you discussed it. I know you're not making any decisions, you're making recommendations. It was a letter from a second homeowner saying, don't forget the positive role that we play in the local economy, and discouraging the authority from making sort of knee-jerk sort of decisions to double council tax without thinking through the consequences. That sort of paraphrases it, but I think it's important for me to mention that the letter was received and you were aware of it because you've not actually seen it. But it was essentially the other side of the argument that, you know, second homes do lots of good things. She was a local lady, she moved away, she moved back, she had family connections, and she was encouraging a more balanced debate, put it that way, rather than the sort of the negative connotations that often dominate discussion.
Okay, thank you. So just reverting back to that briefing, Councillor Blathwaite, you proposed it. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Heinrich. So we'll add that to, it can be added to 5, I guess, can't it? Right, okay, with that addition, amendment to 5, are you content to accept those recommendations en bloc? And can I have a proposer, please?
Okay, I did ask that we could get some metrics on for second homes for the different council tax bands. Would that be, does that need to be included in the motion, or can that action just be noted and the housing team will pick that up?
That would be a simple matter just to provide that, wouldn't it? Yes, you can add that in as well. If you're, yep, we can do that. Okay, so can I have a proposer then? We take these recommendations with those 2 changes to recommendation 5. As a proposer, Councillor Housden, Councillor Blathwaite as a seconder. Could I have a show of hands then, please? That looks like unanimous to me. Thank you very much indeed. I'm mindful of the time and the need for a break, if anybody wishes. You okay, that's fine. Prevailing view, do we carry on? Or would you like a break? What do you want, 5 minutes? Or do you want to carry on? Do you want to take 5-minute break? 5-minute break we'll take. Righty-ho. Right, okay. So we've concluded item 11 and we're now moving to item 12 on the agenda, which is the Environment and Quality of Life Scrutiny Panel, Public Convenience Strategy Review and Recommendations. The chairman of that panel being Councillor Blathwaite, would you like to introduce and lead on that, please?
Thank you very much. Before I start, I'd like to thank Matt and all officers, especially Maxine Collis, who contributed to this report in very positive ways. And this is a culmination of 6 months' work. And I think it has been enlightening for all the panel members. And I'd like to thank the panel members as well. I think every contribution has been really worthwhile. Obviously, I believe you will have read the report and its recommendations. And I am happy to commend this report to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Questions then? If there are none at the moment, I'll kick off with one. You've got 14 recommendations there. That's quite a number. And I just wonder whether there is a piece of work that might be done relatively quickly, which is basically to say, of those 14 recommendations, can any of them be conjoined? And would it be possible perhaps to prioritize them in some way? Might that be a helpful thing to do?
Yes, indeed. Actually, peculiarly, recommendation number 14 is the most urgent. So schools break up on Friday, and I'd like to see some action done on this before Friday, but I think that might be pushing it a little bit.
I think that might be optimistic.
On our visit to the water recycling plant on
last week, Thursday.
Last Thursday, I asked the operators if they would be willing to take this sewage as a drop-off point. Interestingly, they would be unable to there because the fluid they used in these receptacles kills the bacteria in the recycling plant. But I have received a communication from the chief executive that he's well aware of the urgency of this issue. On the other ones, I agree. 14. I always believe in 10 commandments, but this is how it broke down naturally. This is, as I say, I think it needs to be taken as a whole, really. The actual operation, as in cleansing standards, perhaps is ongoing. And how we proceed, especially when it comes to 9 and 10, is in the future to a certain extent, because as requirements, as we rebuild, these issues should be taken into account then. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just following up on recommendation 14. And I'm going to speak as somebody who's been caravanning for over 30 years, so and I know how these things work. But we seem to have a breed of self-entitled, some antisocial camper van and motorhome owners around at the moment. As far as I'm aware, unless something's changed, wild camping of any sort, other than certain national park areas, is not legal in Britain. So these vans that park up on the roadside and then dump their waste in our loos are actually in breach of the law anyway. Perhaps we ought to be asking the police to just be a little bit more vigilant about wild camping. Scotland's a different matter, and that's the interesting one. The Scots allow it, and they have made provision. There are maps available to motorhome owners in Scotland as to where they can dump waste. Now, there's often a charge for that, and that could be an issue, of course. But there are ways of doing it. We might want to look at the model that the Scottish Government and the local authorities are using, and the nature of facilities. I mean, there's also the other issue, not just the black waste, but the grey waste from wash basins and what have you. Most of these vehicles have retention tanks on board. And it worries when I see articles in the various news groups and social media groups, these people who recommend just leaving the tap open and draining it as you've got the motorway. There is really, given the advice from the Camping Caravan Club, Caravan and Motorhome Club and others, there is no excuse for that. But these people, there are some people who think they can get away with it. We would think, I think, be the first authority in England to actually look at putting in some sort of disposal facilities, but it's like there are disposal facilities. They are on the campsites. They are not hugely expensive. Even small CLs, Lighthouse at Walcott, for example, I just happened to be having dinner there last night, and they have a nice little CL alongside. They charge £12.50 a night, other than the school holidays. It's not an excessive amount. You can afford 45,000 minimum for a camper van. You can afford to pay for a site, and people really should be encouraged to do so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think you make a valid point. The only point I would say is that it is happening, and it's a very real problem, and we've got to do something to address it in some way, shape or form. Quite what that is, I really don't know. But anyway, Councillor Blathwaite.
Just to say, we needn't look at Scotland, we can look at the Broads. Every boat has a facility. Thank you very much.
Okay. Councillor Holliday.
On that point, it'd be great if NNDC could have a discussion, because the very small coastal group that's been looking at this, we've been discussing with some of the officers, and we haven't actually got much traction in the fact that wild camping is illegal, but we do seem to embrace it. There's quite a sort of divergence of opinion, really. And I do think that NNDC needs, we've discussed putting in waste disposal units. We've discussed trying to get commercial campsites to take non-resident waste. And I do feel that we could do more in that. And I think it's £10,000 that someone said yesterday at our meeting that it costs to put in a waste disposal unit. So it's not terribly expensive. We talked about putting them in at recycling places, such as the new one that's going in at Sheringham. So there are various things we could do. I think we need a discussion with NNDC about this strategically, because at the moment, I think the community feels very differently from NNDC, and NNDC aren't quite on board with the fact that wild camping is very deleterious to our environment, because we have ditches on the coast being polluted with camper van waste, and it's totally unacceptable. So I would very much welcome Councillor Heinrich's proposal.
Thank you. So, any further questions? Councillor Seawood.
Yes, just wearing my financial hat, Chairman, I noticed that in the financial implications, it was said that a budget has already been agreed for the audit process. I don't know if anybody can help me about what the budget is. Matt's got his hand up. My understanding was that we gave 30,000 for doing this. If this hasn't been spent, is that the balance?
So yeah, that's correct. £30,000 remains. However, there will be need to be a procurement process for that external audit of the facilities. There is in the appendix is a guide as to what that kind of audit would include.
We're a very frugal committee.
Yes, Chairman, and perhaps I'm not as frugal as you. So.
Right.
Regarding finance, we're also part of the recommendation is that the cubicle nature of new toilets. We have asked that there be a cost benefit analysis on that, but the feeling the feeling I got was that will be financially beneficial in the long term.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm just wondering, clearly your panel is the most informed about the detail that's all behind this, and in particular the formulation of those 14 recommendations. How would you view a further meeting to condense those or to prioritize those, taking into account some of the discussions that we've had this morning? And would that be helpful to Cabinet? Because eventually this is going to go to Cabinet for you to consider. This is part of the package of work that was asked of overview and scrutiny. So would you see that as a helpful step in that direction, those Cabinet members here today?
Chairman, yes. In terms of, it would help to prioritise. Clearly, some things are going to have to come to Cabinet if you want them actioned. But in terms of the external audit, you've got a budget for it if it's within that budget. And that's what the panel wishes to get on and do, then it doesn't, as I see it, need to come back to Cabinet. It can be done, and you should just get on with it.
Then that's, I guess, the only other issue that I think we need to be mindful of is that, technically speaking, the panel, the life of the panel, it's up to us to decide, but I think the life of the panel might well be coming to technically an end, and we would need to agree to extend that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. The panel, the Environment and Quality of Life panel, was set up for a trial period of 6 months. If there is a need for prioritization of those recommendations, I know that many of them are kind of long-term things. They don't need to be implemented particularly quickly, other than that recommendation 14. Perhaps that's something that could be done just via email, circulated amongst the panel members to agree that if there are any ones that need prioritization, to negate the need to go through that full process of having a full meeting established with availability check, that kind of thing.
Would you be willing to proceed on that basis? And what about the inclusion of the audit? At what stage would that be done?
Well, that would be the matter for the panel. I don't know what their minds will be in terms of who does it. But if they were looking to property services, they might come back and say there's resource constraints. So you might have to go outside, but if you've got the funding, and I think it would be important to get on and do it, and it would certainly assist us in terms of getting a better handle over where we are with our toilets, and in terms of influencing the next improvement programme. So, but just be careful over resources, because I'm not sure you're going to get a positive response out of property services.
Okay, with that caveat, would you be comfortable in going those 2 further steps?
Yes, speaking for myself, Chairman, and I think I've received the nods from my colleagues. So yes, we would.
Okay, and technically, do we need to sort of agree a recommendation on that along those lines?
I think it's fine to just approve them as they are, and then they can be prioritised by the panel via email and then passed on as normal recommendations to Cabinet. One thing I would just mention, and I'd like to check this with Cara as she's here, that £30,000 funding allocation was already agreed by Cabinet and has been essentially, I suppose, gifted to use for that purpose. Obviously, if that work from an external resource meets the procurement threshold, is there any further decision required to approve that funding? Do we know, or can it just be done under delegated authority, because it potentially a relatively small sum?
It is a relatively small sum. I don't know what the original recommendation or the agreement about the £30,000 was. I think that would need to be looked at further, and then I could consider that as need to be and give some advice in regard to the procurement.
Presumably that would be once that piece of work has been scoped or defined and then considered in terms of what the likely cost of that would be, and if that cost needed then to go to tender or go to through whatever process.
Yes, it depends what bands that would fall in.
I do just think for reference as well, I think that the estates team had mentioned, and Harry, you might remember this, that they do have or have used previously external resource that does that type of work. I don't know that if that would be within the procurement threshold or not, but it's certainly something that we've used before, that type of work. So.
Okay, so we got it kind of there in principle as far as the allocation is concerned, and we would just need more information in terms of how to do the detail of that.
Sorry, Chairman, I might have been estates that would be responsible rather than property services. I'm not too sure, but I think in either case there might be questions asked about capacity.
Yes, I'm sure there will be. Okay, what do you need from us today?
So in terms of the committee, it's up for you to have this proposed recommended and voted on to show that the committee is supportive of those recommendations going forward to Cabinet, essentially subject to the reprioritisation or prioritisation by members of the panel.
So in sort of practical terms here, this will go forward to Cabinet as almost an interim report.
Well, it will. The recommendations will go forward in September, so there's a lot of time to kind of work out that prioritisation of recommendations.
The prioritisation, but yeah. then there's the audit on top of that.
So once the audit work is undertaken, that comes back, and then it's the responsibility of the relative service areas to act upon those relative to the other recommendations based in the report. So I think in terms of that prioritisation, the two key priorities are getting that external audit done and the waste disposal facilities, and then the other recommendations are kind of a follow-on from that, essentially.
Clear as mud.
I don't think my essential, sorry, in summary, there doesn't need to be any more input from the panel, so to speak.
Okay.
The recommendations are dependent on the outcome of that external audit.
All right, okay. Good enough. Okay, so the recommendation we got here is the working group has made the 14 recommendations that are listed throughout the report, summarised in Appendix 3 on page 10 of the report. Are you happy to to accept those, subject to those additional pieces of work? Councillor Holliday.
Sorry, I wasn't quite clear. Do we have, before looking at the camper van waste, do we have to wait for Cabinet to approve this in September, or can we go ahead and discuss that now?
I think on the camper van waste issue, I know that that's being considered as part of the levelling up and regeneration bids. So one of those facilities at least, and I know that the relevant assistant director has already kind of progressed that work separately from this. So this will just strengthen that work that's already in the way, essentially.
Okay. Councillor Fredericks.
Just a quick one. Can we not just get this done? Can we not just talk to estates and get the officer to order the waste disposal?
That is absolutely, sorry, in terms of starting the external audit work and the waste sites, I mean, like I said, the work on the waste sites is already underway from a separate piece of work.
Okay, I'm just worried that we're going to miss the boat.
Yeah, I mean, even if the recommendation was accepted by Cabinet tomorrow, the chance of getting those waste disposal facilities in place for this summer is limited, I think, unless there are kind of mobile disposal options.
Yeah, there would be, wouldn't there? Like,
there ought to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I not recommend it? Can you not recommend that the officer looks into
the detail of that kind of thing, but Councillor Holliday.
2 points. One is we may not get the levelling up money, in which case then we don't get that waste disposal. So that's only a possibility. That's not an absolute. And second is I'll be absolutely clear that we've explored the possibility of using commercial waste disposal on a non-resident basis, because I don't know that officers have had the time to do that as comprehensively as perhaps they should have done, and that might be a short-term fix. I'm not guaranteeing that capacity is out there, but I know that Stiffkey campsite, for example, will accept non-resident camper van waste. And if there are others, then that might be the short-term fix. If we could make that, if someone could look at that really quickly, and then we could make that publicly available, that might be a solution, a short-term solution.
Sounds as though that might be something well worth following.
I think it's worth following. Perhaps I should just read something that the Chief Executive wrote on this subject. Firstly, wild camping is illegal in most parts of England such that it shouldn't be encouraged, although there is an increasing lobby group campaign for real airs, which is promoting both the concept of wild camping and provision of services such as chemical waste disposal facilities by local authorities. So, to my mind, that is an acceptance of realpolitik, that we need somewhere for wild campers to dispose of this fluid at the first, as soon as we possibly can. He goes on to say the provision of chemical waste disposal facilities for use by motorhome owners by the council would come at a cost. Eric. As would be the suggestion that the motorhome owners be able to park overnight for nominal cost on district council owned car parks. And that raises the wider issue of quality, amenity, and particularly if it was suggested we apply different policies to members of the travelling community, whereas a council we have faced issues in the past. That, of course, raises further questions than it does answers in a way, but I think we need to recognise the realpolitik that we have wild camping and camping vans on our car parks, certainly at Sea Pawling. And I have to say that the actual people I've encountered on Sea Pawling car park in camper vans have been unwavering polite and very aware of their environmental responsibilities. But I don't feel that's probably true in all cases. And I think we need to be getting on with this as soon as possible. So I would like to make the recommendation that we put this forward as a matter of urgency to be dealt with as soon as funds could come available. Thank you very much.
Recommendation 14.
Recommendation 14.
Right. I mean, I think the essence here is that there is a very real problem. It's a health problem. And certainly under the conditions we've had the last few days, it's even more so. And so I think there does have to be a solution to that. The solution to the longer term problem, however, is one I think which will do a different approach. So I think we need to be aware of that short term need. Right. Okay. So with those I
was just saying, Chairman, that from a governance perspective, if the recommendation 14 is accepted and there is a minor change to the wording there to make that, you know, as soon as possible, from a governance perspective, technically that still shouldn't happen until Cabinet accept that recommendation. However, if Cabinet seek to pursue action on that matter of their own accord, then that can be kind of started as soon as possible.
Could I just try to help? There's not a Cabinet meeting now until September.
Yeah, that was my concern. So
and
to not wait that long.
I mean, what Councillor Halliday is saying, quite rightly in my view, is what can be done very quickly in the next week or two to try and deal with some of the more problematic areas. And so what I would suggest, Matt, is that recommendation is shooted over to Steve Hems later today, copied into Nigel Lloyd as the relevant Cabinet member, and it's indicated this was a strong recommendation and the Cabinet members that were here today were supportive of it. And then let's see how we go. Councillor
Holiday.
But in fact, the recommendation that we're saying should be done very quickly is the one to look at existing commercial solutions rather than looking to build them at a waste disposal facility or at a public recycling centre or at an existing loo. So what we're looking, there's a long-term recommendations, but the short-term recommendations we're looking at is there anything we can look at now, like commercial campsites
That
not
would
maybe
be-
used, and we believe that there might be capacity. That's what I would be focusing on the here and now. And are there any temporary solutions that we could buy in,
Yes.
like the equivalent
Yes.
of a portaloo? So that it's an adjunct to that, but what we're actually recommended to be done now is not recommendation 14.
No, that's broken down into two elements.
Yeah. Just make sure we've got the wording correctly. Otherwise, what's being sent to Steve Hems is completely incorrect. What we're asking Steve Hems to do is to look for portable and temporary camper van waste units and what is available in the community that hasn't been explored fully in terms of utilising what capacity we have. Is that not
Recommendation
correct?
15.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Can't argue with that. As long as we know what 15 is about. All right. Okay. With those in, sorry. There you go.
Sorry about that. Just in terms of Matt raising the governance issue, is this not unauthorised expenditure though?
Is it? Do you mean if you were to act upon it without it being, that is the issue, isn't it? Yeah. So if it wouldn't come from a recommendation from Scrutiny, it would be up to Cabinet to take the initiative to implement that of their own accord.
That would be my understanding.
So that's, Chairman, why I said it should go to the Cabinet member, because that might be needed to get some authority.
All I can say is that we can only make recommendations. So what happens to that after that in terms of approval of the expenditure is a bit beyond this committee. But I guess what we're after is making sure that the recommendation reflects what we're really after. And I think we've probably teased that one out and defined that into the two elements of that. We've got, you can either say 14 has got two parts or you can add 15 to it. Councillor Gay.
I'm sorry to be thick here, Chairman. I think Councillor Holliday's point is very well made, and I wondered if you had exact wording for this recommendation 15. I think it might be a good idea.
Let's hear what you've got.
I think from my perspective, what I'm hearing essentially is that all options need to be considered and expedited to provide short-term or immediate solutions to camper van waste disposal for this summer period. So,
Do you think we should give more steer to the officer on that? Because he hasn't been party to this conversation. I think we should suggest these are the options that have been suggested, which are using commercial camping facilities for non-residents and exploring the options of a temporary portable camper van waste, that sort of thing. Is that what you're thinking about?
That's certainly the direction that we would point them.
Otherwise, I think Steve's going to start from scratch, and let's save him some time.
Yeah. Okay. I think with that clarity around that. Okay, can I have a proposer then that we accept these recommendations as amended, or 14, 15 amended? Councillor Varley, you proposing? A seconder, please. Councillor Holliday. Show of hands. That looks good to me, everyone. Thank you. Right. Moving on then to item 13. A waste contract target operating model. Do we have a verbal update?
yes. Well, we've got a written update from Steve Hems. You're obviously unable to attend this morning, so I'll just read this out to you. So we continue to work with Serco over the implementation of the target operating model. The fuel tank at the Elsham depot is now fully operational. The recent focus has been on delivery of the collections target operating model, which sees the reorganisation of the rounds and routes to be more effective and efficient. Serco have shared the draft collection rounds with officers, and we have provided back some challenges and suggestions, which they are currently investigating. The new collection rounds will come into effect on Monday, 5th of September 2022. There will be changes to collection times all day for around 90% of households across the district. Serco are working up the communications to residents, including the collection calendars, and work closely with our communications team in the run-up to the change to promote this change. Members will be provided with a briefing by Serco in due course. During the recent hot weather, we agreed with Serco early start times so that crews could get collections done before the temperatures increased too much. Despite this, some disruption to collections has occurred, mainly due to issues with vehicles suffering heat-related problems and staff who'd succumbed to the heat. All Serco staff have done an amazing job in the circumstances, and I would wish to extend my thanks to them all. And he's happy to respond to any questions in writing, should there be any.
Anybody have any questions that they'd like to send on to Mr. Nhs? Councillor Blathwaite.
Yeah, if you could pass on this question. Is he satisfied with the level of service from Serco at the waste disposal areas for the ramp at Sea Palling? We have been suffering huge disruption to our holidaymakers with piles of rubbish that have not been collected. I would ask for an urgent look that the level of service from Serco at this particular area be increased. Thank you.
Okay, that's a holiday.
Is it Serco who open and close the Weybourne toilet? Does anybody know? Because they don't always open it, this is not the radar controlled eco-loo, this is the portaloo that's been put on the beach. So sometimes it doesn't get opened with disastrous results. If that could be looked at, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, it's my understanding that it would be Serco staff that opens those. Yeah. Any other questions? You're happy to note, subject to those two questions, that update? Okay. Right. Duly noted. And item 14, Cabinet Work Programme.
There's not a great deal to update here. Obviously, there's no meeting in August as planned. The finance reports are expected in September. However, we wait to see what happens with those. In terms of additional items, we'll have these two significant lists of recommendations from the Overview and Scrutiny Committee today that will go to Cabinet. And that's all to add, really.
Okay. Councillor Seawood, anything you'd like to add with regard to the finance reports that we are expecting?
There has been some recent communications in the last week about this. I have now been assured, as has the chairman of the audit committee, that the outturn report will be ready to go through the committee cycle in September, as long as with the first quarter report of this financial year.
September.
And I expect to receive a draft report in the middle of August.
Thank you for that. Any questions on the Cabinet Work Programme? No. The committee work programme?
Yep, just cycle through there. So as you can see, for the September, if depending on what comes through there, we could have a very heavy agenda, so we will adjust accordingly. We do have the performance monitoring and benchmarking reports that will come back. There's been some information shared in relation to that, I think yesterday. We've also we're awaiting items such as the Sheringham Leisure Centre project review. We're still awaiting accounts closed down on that from the contractor. So just waiting really to see if these things will come forward or not, and we will adjust accordingly and try and be flexible to fit those things in September.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions on that? No? Right. Okay. Then we have nothing further on the agenda. So thank you all very much indeed for your attendance today and your contributions. And fortunately, we weren't meeting yesterday or the day before. So it's been warm enough today though.